Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Alyssa Talley. Alyssa is pursuing a master's degree in history at University of Victoria. Her master's research focuses on the way public history sites incorporate perpetrator narratives into traditional memory frameworks. We will discuss that research today. It's a pleasure to have you on my show. Alyssa,
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Alyssa, what is comparative history and what draw your interest to it?
Yeah, so comparative history is definitely a very complex subject, and it can mean many different things depending on what you're studying, what period you're studying, and that sort of thing. For my research in particular, I focused on public history sites. So comparative history in my case was looking at two different sites that had to do with different points in history. Public history it's fairly generic. It's difficult to sort of pinpoint exactly what it is, but generally it's any sort of history project that is designed more for the public versus an academic audience. It's often generated by an academic committee or source, but it is definitely meant for the public. So the most classic example of that would be a museum.
Mhm.
But now it can include things like movies, documentaries, podcasts, that sort of thing. So it's a really, really wide, broad range of topics. For my case in particular, I decided to focus on heritage sites. So you can think of heritage sites like a battlefield would be a heritage site, or a castle might be a heritage site. But the two that I focused on were the House of the Wannsee Conference in Germany and a plantation located just outside of New Orleans, Louisiana, called Oak Alley Plantation.
Nice. Alyssa, for your master's research, you are studying the way public history sites incorporate perpetrator narratives. Can you tell us about your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's probably best to start off with sort of like a general idea of what those two sites are and why they're
Hmm.
significant in history.
Okay.
So the House of the Wannsee Conference was made famous because of a conference that was held there in January of 1942. And if people are familiar with the Holocaust and the idea of the final solution, generally we do the final solution in quotation marks because that's perpetrator language. Generated by the Nazis. But it was a conference that previously historians thought that it was a conference that was designed to sort of decide whether or not they would conduct this genocide of European Jewry. But as time has gone on, it's generally understood now that when they met in January 1942, they already knew this was going to happen, and that conference was just there to decide how it was going to happen and to assign roles, enact different laws, and that sort of thing. And so this conference was held in this beautiful villa on the shores of a lake just outside of Berlin, Germany, and there was 15 Nazi officials who were there. Just lasted a day and then it was done. But now it's been converted into a museum and an education site. Conversely, in the US, Oak Alley Plantation was it was opened in the antebellum period. So the antebellum period is generally considered to be the time from the formation of the US government in around 1832 to the start of the Civil War in 1860. So it was opened in the 1830s as a sugar plantation, governed, as most people know, by a white sort of governing family, and then had a number of African enslaved people there working on the sugar plantation as well. And so continued in that way until 1865 when the Civil War ended. And then it transitioned through a number of different owners through that time period up until about the 1920s when the current family who owns it. They own it. It's been made into a public. It has a federation that runs it, but it is actually the same family who still has some say over what happens with the committee that runs it, which is interesting. So Oak Alley Plantation opened in 1978, and the House of the Wannsee Conference opened to the public in 1992. So less than 20 years between the two. From when they opened to the public. So in terms of perpetrator history, House of the Wannsee Conference, it's pretty standard to think of that as a perpetrator site because it was perpetrators who met there. We think collectively as a society that those were the perpetrators. The Nazis were the perpetrators in that place. The Oak Alley Plantation is a little bit different because Generally, as a society, we don't think of enslavers and slave owners as being perpetrators. We don't use that language. So it becomes a little bit more murky. And that was definitely what my research centered on was why don't we say that these were perpetrators? Why weren't the enslaved people victims and the others, the slave owners, perpetrators? We just don't. It's not in the lexicon. You won't see that when you visit these places. So I was very interested in sort of the discrepancy with that. And then also how, if any ways, language is used and that sort of thing, and education is used to sort of display or not convey that message to a public audience.
So, how do we define who a perpetrator is?
Yeah, that's another very complex question. Again, I'll go from both sides. So in Germany, even Germans wouldn't consider themselves to be perpetrators up until about the 1990s. Reunification, the fall of the Berlin Wall, had a huge part to play in that, because up until that point we had, East Germany and West Germany, two different places, and so they were governed differently. They had different remembrance cultures, different memorial cultures. So there wasn't a unified sort of collective memory of that time period. Once the Berlin Wall fell, there is a book called Ordinary Men. It's quite famous book by Christopher Browning. It's actually so famous that it's now has a Netflix documentary on it if you want to check that out. But it's about how up until the 1990s, Germans sort of thought that general soldiers, the Wehrmacht, the general army, didn't really do anything. They were just following orders. They were fighting on the front lines. And in reality, they were definitely taking part in this genocide of European Jewry, different persecuted groups in Nazi Germany that hadn't really been discussed up until that point. So that's when there's a really big shift in Germany about who the perpetrators are. And that sort of is at the end result of some of the trials that happened immediately following the Second World War. So we have people are generally familiar with the Nuremberg trials and that sort of thing, where we looked at perpetrators, but on a much, much more intense scale. So like, who were these people who were signing the orders for genocide and that sort of thing? And so as time went on, the idea of who perpetrator was very much broadened.
Okay.
In the US, it's different because we didn't have that set of trials. It was sort of life carried on. It was just against the law to enslave people after 1865. And so we have a very different version. And the US is really still coming to terms. There is no collective memory of, sort of we were perpetrators in this, even up to this day. And so who a perpetrator is there and how we look at that time period, the antebellum period, where slavery was really at its peak, is really undefined. And that's one of the challenges in these sites in incorporating perpetrator narratives, is who even is a perpetrator. So it really varies. Historians tend to shy away from the topic. You can find a lot more in sort of the legal world, as well as anthropology. Anthropologists working in the field of genocide have really sort of tried to nail down who we consider to be a perpetrator, and again, work to broaden what that definition looks like. So rather than, characterizing, oftentimes perpetrators are characterized in a very dehumanizing way. And so they're, it can be perceived as like madmen or that sort of thing. They are sort of people that we want to distance ourselves from. But anthropologists and historians slowly have been working to sort of like humanize these people. Like, who were they? We can see that even in popular culture, like the movie The Zone of Interest, where we sort of see this very normal family doing some very horrible things. And that's sort of the shift that's been happening since the 1990s in terms of looking at perpetrators. So it is an evolving definition, I'd say.
Yeah, interesting. So, how should we remember the victims versus the perpetrators?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think most people, um, I think it really depends first on who you are. And I will say that for my research, just looking at positionality and where I was coming from this, my family has ties with the Black Southern community down in the US. And so I think coming from that makes it easier for me to cover this topic. I know people who come from it from the other direction. So if you have family ties with the perpetrators, like, it can be a very sensitive topic. And so when we remember that, and we memorialize these things and we create exhibits, it's really important to be sensitive to this? So who is our audience, and what background might be they be bringing to this experience? So I think that's really important. I also think that when it comes to remembering perpetrators, there's a lot more context that needs to be added. So what was the lead up to this event? Why did these people come to these thought patterns, ideas, and sort of beliefs that led them to these actions? And also realize that there's a huge range of perpetration and a huge range of who we might consider to be a perpetrator and who we might not. It's a bit more murky, you could almost argue, than a victim. So just keeping that nuance. And I would also say in public history sites, something that differs between the US and Germany is that when you go to a US plantation, one of the main exhibits that you see is the big house, is what it's called. And this is like the mansion that is very typical that you see in movies like Gone with the Wind and that sort of thing. And that is where the primary tour is centered. And the big house gets its name from its relative size to the slave cabins that were there. And so you see this tour, there's lots and lots of artifacts, lots of furniture from the family who owned it. And it's very humanizing. We see that family, we see the way they lived, we see who they were. Whereas in Germany, when we see the perpetrator sites, they're often stripped of a lot of their artifacts. We might see like the framework, we might see the walls, the rooms, but we don't see those individual pieces within. So it is dehumanizing in a way that is something that can it's up for debate whether or not this is the best way to do it or not. But oftentimes, so example for the House of the Wannsee Conference, it's a bit more challenging to remember perpetrators versus victims because a lot of the perpetrators didn't repent. They felt no regret after the war. And so whereas in a victim site, we might include a letter or a memento or something that sort of humanizes people and gave us an idea of who they are, German sites had to be very, very careful because perpetrators in Nazi Germany tended not to be repentant. And so incorporating sort of memoirs or letters or that sort of thing post-war is not done. So it's nuanced for sure and complex with what message we want to portray to the audience.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the next question I want to ask you. What are some complexity of incorporating these perpetrator narratives into public history sites?
Yeah, so I think, like I was talking about the artifact aspect, but I think the other part is the narrative that we generate when we are talking about these perpetrators. What message do we want to convey to the audience who's seeing these places? Generally, it's not just, at least now, it's not, and I'm going to speak more from a German perspective, and the German theory is that we don't just want to say, remember that this happened. That's important. But we also want to look at the message that we can take away. And are there things that we might be able to apply to our life today that happened then and sort of really be aware? I think also some of the complexity. So oftentimes when we remember a dark event like a genocide, it's much easier and much more attuned to human nature to identify with the victim. We want to identify with the victim because we want to ultimately believe that we are like good people, sort of thing. Whereas when we're asking people to sort of put themselves in the shoes of the perpetrator, there's much more of like a cognitive disconnect and a cognitive working around that needs to happen at that site that really requires some sensitivity. In the House of the Wannsee Conference, there is a panel outside in the garden that sort of addresses this and how people, based on their family backgrounds, their familiarity with perpetrator stories, might find it more difficult than others to sort of comprehend how this happened and almost putting yourself in the shoes of the perpetrators and trying to figure out how they could have let this happen and how they could have done this. So it's definitely adds to the complexity of it.
So I want to ask you a slightly personal question. So you traveled to this historical site, this Oak Alley plantation in New Orleans and in Louisiana, and the House of Wannsee Conference in Berlin, Germany. How did these field experiences affected, of course, your research, but also affected you as a person?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's funny because I sort of stumbled into comparative history and this whole degree because of vacation, because I had always had this huge interest in history. While I did my Bachelor of Science in psychology, all my electives were in history, so I had that love. But in 2022, I really wanted to go to New Orleans. My family had been there already, and I had never been, and I really wanted to go to the plantations because I had never been to those. So I did that. That same year, I also went to Germany and saw some of the concentration camps there. And that's really what spurred my interest. I came back from that trip and decided I have to do my master's. I have to write on this because there's so many questions I have. I need to do more research on this. And so I started my master's and then had the opportunity to go on this field school, which is run by a professor at the University of Victoria, Dr. Helga Thornton, and she works out of the Germanic and Slavic Studies department, but opens up this program to anybody in the university, sort of any sort of like undergraduate, graduate. You can be in first year, you can be in your last year of your master's, your PhD, it doesn't matter. And what it is it takes students, 20 students. So there's a sort of a interview selection process, 20 students, and you go to various countries. It differs, like it runs every other year and it differs each time it runs. And this time we went to Germany, Poland, and Austria. And so you get a sense of there's a lot of prep work. You spend a lot of time before you go learning about different places, talking to different people, lots of guest speakers, speaking with different Holocaust survivors and that sort of thing to get a sense of what you're going to go to. And there you go on the field school, you go and see a bunch of the different sites, but you also spend some time speaking with other post-secondary students. So we spent time with post-secondary students in all three countries. So it gives you a sense of what they are learning and their perspective, both from growing up in that environment, but also studying it also in that environment, which is a very different experience, I would say, than, studying it removed in North America. Mm. So getting that perspective definitely provides a more holistic view of everything, and such a unique experience to do that sort of experiential learning when you're in the place, being able to see exactly what's going on. So yeah, my travels have definitely evolved. It started out very personal, and then doing this more academically focused trip, which lasts 5 weeks. Mm-hmm. In the spring semester, definitely added to my work. I don't think it would have been a completely different project without having gone on the field school, for sure, because it raised so many different questions with everything. And also, I would say, especially in my trips to Europe, allows for a lot more context. So I wrote specifically about the House of the Wannsee Conference, but it's by no means the only perpetrator site in Germany, and also looking at how this site compares to victim sites. So, for example, like a former concentration camp. But another really famous perpetrator site in Berlin is the Topography of Terror in downtown Berlin, which is where the old Gestapo building used to be, but they've transformed it, and it's now this big it's an outdoor and indoor, they call them sort of documentation centers, where they talk about the rise of the National Socialism and that sort of thing and how that came about, and then the after effects. And then you can go and see the actual structures that were pretty much demolished in the 20th century, but you can see the remnants of that, which is very experiential as well.
In your study of these historical sites, why countries remember these historical sites or these events differently?
Yeah, so I would say they definitely do. I think the overall layout, and I think that's why you can do this sort of comparative history, is that there are similarities. So if you look at a picture of Oak Alley and the Wannsee Conference, you'd be hard pressed to decide like which country is this from, because they both are really big houses. They both are surrounded by beautiful gardens. They're both very idyllic. They look beautiful from the outside. They're both tourist attractions. You can go in TripAdvisor and see them. You can book a tour. So there's lots and lots of similarities between them. But when you look into sort of the small details of it, you can see how the approach to the subject is very different. And I would say that the approach in terms of an accountability, responsibility standpoint is very different. So, for example, Oak Alley, the plantation that I studied, up until 2018, they would have their tour guides would dress up in hoop skirts and that sort of thing and lead people around. So it was a very sort of romanticized idea of this. And there wasn't really any incorporation of enslaved stories at all. The focus was on the big house. You stayed there. And then that was it. This was the kind of the story. They might, mention where the slave cabins used to be, but it really wasn't a focus. They've tried to sort of incorporate that a little bit more now, but I mean, this is 2018, so it's been just barely 7 years since that happened. So it's very, very fresh. I would also say that there are some practicalities involved with running these sites in terms of who runs them. Is it the government? Is it a private organization? How are they getting their funding, et cetera? And that really affects how they approach their subject as well. So in Germany, all the sites are sort of state-based. Receive government funding. They're much, much less reliant. It's free to go to the House of the Wannsee conference. You don't pay to go into any site in Germany that's related. You never pay to go into a former concentration camp or anything like that, where you might learn something because they feel like it should just be open to everybody. Whereas in the US, there is no government backing for any of these sites. So they all need to be privately funded. They need to figure out how they're going to get the financial ability to run these sites themselves. And very often that comes from tourists. And so how they have to market and approach their subject is different because they are appealing to, I would almost say, a much broader audience at the end of the day, because they do have to, if you're going for a weekend in New Orleans, like maybe it's a 45 an hour ride away from New Orleans to get to the plantations. Can you sort of fit that into your schedule? And can, there be a bus tour that does that for you that then generates the revenue to run that site? So yeah, there's some sort of academic ways that it's affected, but also very practical ways that affect the running of the sites and the approach.
Do you know why these two different countries, different governments have different approach?
I think that the US is still reckoning with that time period. And I still think you see it today in things like critical race theory, what's taught in schools. Education plays a huge component in it in terms of generating a collective memory. So how do we as a nation agree to remember this event? And the US is still at a point where they agree to how they are remembering this event. It varies very differently depending on who you talk to, where you are, and that sort of thing. Whereas in Germany, after reunification in 1990, 1991, there was this reckoning and this real looking at those events. And also, I would say, a sense of ownership and a sense of guilt. The US doesn't feel any guilt necessarily for what it's done. There's been various scholars who have written on it to say that guilt is one of the main components that you need in order to have a really honest reckoning with it. And without any guilt, with this idea of American exceptionalism, it's very difficult to sort of change the narrative and sort of make it so important that the government thinks it needs to fund it. And right now it's definitely not there. So these sites, they're trying, but they still are very much privately funded and working in different ways. There are different. There's one in particular site that opened, I want to say, in 2014 in New Orleans, and it's called the Whitney Plantation, and it's, as far as I know, the only site in the USA that approaches the topic in this way. But what they do is they tell the story only from the enslaved perspective. So the Whitney Plantation was a functioning plantation. It had lots of people there, and they have really removed the focus from the big house. Really, there's nothing there. There's no artifacts. You don't spend any time there. But what they've done is, in the 1930s, the U.S. government realized that they were going to lose the stories of everyone who was enslaved, and so they went around and they tried to interview all these older people who had been enslaved during the antebellum period. Got their stories. And so this site incorporates some of the oral testimony from that. It also looks at the slave database. So it looks at everyone who was there. And you can see big panels of names and sort of tries to put more of a humanizing factor on it. Like these were the actual people who were here, which is a very, very different experience. It's a nonprofit and they focus a lot on education and that sort of thing. But it is the one exception, but it is also very recent.
Okay. So I want to ask you, Alyssa, how does language play a role in how we remember things?
Yeah. I think I've touched on it a little bit. It plays a
Yeah.
huge role. Even just like what I was talking about before, about how we don't talk about enslavers
Mm,
as perpetrators. We don't use that language. It's not common. It's not, no one, people would probably look at you like you were crazy if you did that, which is very interesting. And probably one of the first steps in order to being able to create a different collective memory is looking at it like that. So there's that. There's also just the language that the site itself uses. So, for example, Oak Alley Plantation really identifies with its role as a National Historic Landmark in the US. It doesn't call itself a museum, an educational site, nothing like that. So I feel like in some ways, and there's been research on this, it sort of absolves it from being really, really historically accurate, really going in depth into those sort of things. Whereas in the German, since they also just the German language has a lot more names for things. So, for example, a Denkmal is a place where you're supposed to think about things. Um, and so there's a bunch of different terminology, but the House of the Bonsai Conference is a museum and an education center. So they're very clear on what their purpose is and what they're doing and who their audience is, what their focus is. So I think that's really important, the naming themselves, but then also, and I'm always careful when I'm speaking, but also how we call the perpetrators and how we call the
mm,
victims themselves is important too. In the
mm,
US, again, very recently, very, very recently. So 1999 was the first time there was a defining difference between calling people who were enslaved versus slaves. And it's something that when I was on my tour in New Orleans in 2022, they made an emphasis of saying, like, these people were enslaved. They were not slaves, because it just sort of reduces that person to,
mm,
to their status in society, kind of. And it's very dehumanizing. So generally, when we speak of Black people who were enslaved, we call them enslaved versus slaves. And we also don't call them slave owners. We call them enslavers as well. So
mm,
there's that differentiation. In Germany, too, there is a sort of reckoning with language as well, especially with victims. Perpetrators are sort of not as complicated, but there's a bunch of different people who were persecuted under the Nazi regime, besides Jews. So one example would be the Roma and Sinti people. Up until, again, recently, all these things are happening very recently, like 2014, 2015, they decided to review some of their exhibits that used a term in German that we would equate to the word gypsy today in North America, which is obviously not the best word to be using. So what they did is they had this initiative and they went through the entire exhibit that looked at the Roma and Sinti population, and they kept the exhibit with the old language. But what they did is they put these little, like, highlighted, almost like post-it note sort of things that said, like, this is now inaccurate. Like, this is the term that we should use instead, and this is why. This was an incorrect way, and this is perpetuating the language of the perpetrator. So that's another thing that needs to be avoided in both places. And just when we're considering dark history
mhm,
at all, is just, are we perpetuating the language of the perpetrator versus using language that is more authentic to
mm,
the victim themselves?
How does educational programming play a role in commemorating events and community engagement?
Yeah, I think that education, it plays a huge role, or it should, I should say, it should play a huge role. What I found in my travels is that both countries, sort of like I touched on with language, how they define themselves plays a huge role in the responsibility they feel in terms of educating. So if you go to Oak Alley Plantation, there are no education programs.
Mm,
You go to the plantation, and that's it. You visit, they actually have you can stay in these sort of like almost replica slave cabins.
Mm,
It's a very awkward situation. So you sort of like have this idyllic situation where you go on vacation, relax, take in the gardens sort of thing, but it's also on this plantation,
mm,
with no educational programming whatsoever. You could contrast that. So Oak Alley is on the River Road, in the River Road area of Louisiana, which is along the Mississippi River, and you find a lot of plantations along this area because of its proximity to the Mississippi River. And so the Whitney Plantation is actually just down the road from Oak Alley. But there they do have an educational component where they reach out to school age kids and that sort of thing, and they try and make an effort there. In
mm,
contrast, if you were to look at the House of the Wannsee Conference, education there is paramount. It's in its name, it's in its German name and its full English name, as being an educational center. So not only do they focus on school age kids, post-secondary students, but they also have programs that are targeted at adults. And so what they do is try and say, like, look, if you were a police officer or if you were a teacher or that sort of thing, how might your role have been affected by the Nazis being in power, and how might that have happened, so that they can sort of take that knowledge with them back to their own professions and sort of be aware of some
mm.
of the challenges, the nuance that had to do with that, which I think is a really interesting way of doing that. And I think how interesting that would be in the US to have a similar, there's nothing like that in the US. It's almost, it crosses a line of being too authentic, like too real for the population right now. It's not, the US hasn't quite reached there. So I think in order to have a good education program, you also need to have a collective memory that has been shared generation to generation. And so we're at a generation who are adults who have had this education for this whole period of time and are now able and open-minded enough to, have an honest look at what role they might have played in an institution like that, like slavery. So yeah, there's a lot of different components that come in with education. There's also, like I said, even with visitors, just a generic visitor to an education site, it's challenging for students to put themselves in the places of a perpetrator. Students generally are taught things like Anne Frank, which great, but also puts them in the mindset of a victim. And so, how do we sort of reframe that and think about how would a perpetrator have thought about the same situation? And that can be really challenging because it goes against human nature.
Yeah. You have done a great work and a very interesting research and obviously very important research. So I want to ask you, Alyssa, what do you hope to contribute from this research?
Yeah, so much. I think something that I didn't touch on back when I was talking about comparative history is just one of the frameworks that I looked at for doing this was this idea of multi-directional memory, which is
Mm,
something that was coined by a scholar, Michael Rothberg, in the early 2000s. I think it was 2009. And he talked about this idea of multi-directional memory, which basically argued for the fact that we can compare, and not even so much comparing history, because
mm,
comparative history has a lot of, I want to say almost stigma, like it can be a bit, touchy,
mm,
and fair enough. But looking at multi-directional memory in terms of how do we remember these things, and can we compare how we remember them? And up until this point, there's been some studies that have come out by different philosophers, by different scholars that look at this relationship between Germany and the US, in particular, Nazi Germany and the antebellum period of the US, as well as the Jim Crow period, so the period after the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And a lot of this research has really been victim centered,
mm,
which I think has a lot of value. But in my experience and in my travels and through reading Michael Rothberg's research, I was thinking, how might we also apply this to perpetrators? And I really hope that is something that my research sort of brings light to, is
mm,
how can we look at this differently through the
mm,
eyes of perpetrator history? And how might this be effective? And looking at the different ways that perpetrators might originate their thought processes from, how do these sort of big events happen, and looking at that, but also obviously critically just looking at how these public sites are run as well. I think
Yeah.
there's always room for a critique of public history sites and how they're run. I think some obviously do a better job than others, but also like multi-directional memory argues that it goes both ways. Like the US can learn from Germany, but maybe Germany can learn from the US. And one of the things I argued in my paper was, yeah, like maybe because the US does such a good job of humanizing what I define as perpetrators. The maybe Germany could take that too, because that's one of the key things in perpetrator education and perpetrator
Mm,
history is trying to humanize the perpetrators,
mm,
not making them into this homogenous unit sort of thing.
mm,
So maybe it might be helpful if we included more artifacts or that sort of thing into the German sites to give them more of a human aspect. So
mm,
I think it's interesting, this framework that can go both ways. And I think it's very helpful when we look at comparative history, especially now in the 21st century when and public history in particular, when we're looking at the way they're remembered.
mm.
Yeah.
Nice. So, what is next for you, Alyssa?
Yeah, what's next? That's a good question. Lots of things going on. I'm still working on some conference presentations coming up that I'll be giving on this topic. Hopefully more travel to these sites will be also on the itinerary. And yeah, seeing how I might use what I learned in my master's degree to sort of pursue other avenues of education and apply this in different ways. I think there's many, many different ways that it can
Mhm,
be applied. And that's a good thing, but also it's very challenging because I need to narrow it down to what exactly
yeah,
I want to do. So
yeah,
yeah, considering many different avenues right now, but definitely know that I want to carry what I've learned forwards.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Alyssa, and best wishes on completing your master's degree.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. It's been really fun. Thank you for having me on.